Just start again. Welcome to the Postgame. We are here with the great Professor Richard Wolff. We probably won't have the same banter this time because it would be awkward. We already had it before. It was funny. Trust us. Boy, are you glad it's me. We're here with the whole team. Thank you, each and every one of you. Welcome to the Postgame. We're here. We're live. We have much to get to. Next week, Brianna Joy Gray is here and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'll get to it because we lost 40 seconds, and this is a capitalist economy. So I'm going to be efficient in the time war. We have to get to Ben Burgess. We have to get to Dominique Remy. We have to get to a bunch of other topics we're going to cover. But first, we have a very special edition of Bad, featuring our teacher and mentor, Professor Richard Wolff. And Matt, do we have the bad sound ready? Oh, please put on your headphones for this, Professor.
Believe me, not good.
Oh, well, he's
no
also
good,
going to
really bad for you. Not good. Believe me, not good. No good, really bad for you.
Do you want to put on your headphones to hear the Milton Friedman clip, or you can play it out loud? All right. So we have an old clip of Milton Friedman on greed, and we just wanted to play it. He's on Phil Donahue. And we'll see how much we could stomach. And then Professor Wolff is going to respond to a historic edition of Bad featuring Milton Friedman.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
Wow. Well, dunked and owned. Professor Wolff, this is the best they had. What's your response?
Well, every time I listen to Mr. Friedman, I close my eyes and I say to myself, there's the living proof, or it was living proof, that the Nobel Prize is not given to anybody except if they toe the line. He got a Nobel Prize for telling us that greed is the engine of human behavior, that human beings pursue their own self-interest. This is a man who presumably has a modicum of education. If he did, and I must wonder, listening to this kind of drivel, what the world, did he never understand psychology? For 100 years, psychologists have explained to us with empirical studies and theoretical work that human beings are bundles of contradictions, that what is my self-interest is something I only dimly perceive, and moreover, many of the things I'm interested in contradict one another. I both like and don't like people. I both am drawn to and repulsed by this thing. I want that, but I don't really. I went and I got that, and now I wonder, having consumed it, why did I ever do that? Because I didn't like it at all. We are not some kind of calculus machine.
This is the first noble truth of Buddhism. This
it's
constant
just
state of dissatisfaction.
silly. This mechanical no. We're here pursuing our self-interest as if we knew what it was. Human beings don't know, and they're changing all the time. So even if they know, their knowledge is out of date within moments of having conceived the idea. These are not complex ideas, but they're way beyond anything Mr. Friedman can manage. And that's not, by the way, because he's illiterate or uneducated. It's because he has a job to do. And that job is to sell private enterprise. Capitalist private enterprise is the best thing, the only thing, the right thing. Just beat it over and over. Let me tell you a personal story. I was a graduate student at Stanford University many years ago. And one of my good friends who shared my distaste for capitalism, which was already developed then.
That could be your autobiography, A Distaste for Capitalism.
Yes,
by
and
Richard Wolff.
he came to me one day and said, well, I'm leaving. I said, what do you mean you're leaving? We're in the middle of our graduate education here. He said, well, I got an offer I can't refuse. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I'm going to the University of Chicago. I said, why? He said, because Milton Friedman offered me a quantity of money I never thought I'd see to come there and finish my dissertation, working with him. And that man went on to be a professor, I think he just retired from MIT, which is a very high-level economics department. His radicalism became quiet, something he didn't give up, but he kept very quiet, so a few of us knew about it because we were his friends when he was younger, but officially he was a Chicago boy, as they said. And I remember thinking, oh, that's where all that money that he gets from corporations then begins to develop a school, so they can go out and say what the very smart of the corporations to find a Milton Friedman who will then develop this ideological kind of cohort that will go out and beat the drum. You know, there's a simple story to tell, too. He liked to go around, and when I was a graduate student, I heard him a couple times as he came through, and he would tell this story about how every time private enterprise takes something over, it's done very well, and every time the government takes it over, it's done very poorly. And I won't repeat what we've already talked about, that the evidence he used was the low profit rate, say, of airlines or of trains. And so I had to explain to my students that was the whole point. It's a subsidy of so that to say the private is high and the public is low, as if it were an outcome, misunderstands that it was the goal and the point in the first place. But then I would begin to explain to my students that, for example, in the last 30 years, many of the municipalities in Europe that privatized water, electricity, transport, gas, and so forth have re-municipalized because the rates are too high because of what the private sector did. And so the whole empirical basis was just created by him to support this. But it also shows you that if the wind is blowing in that direction, which in the period of Mr. Friedman's ascendancy it was, corporations were becoming major players in shaping what was going on. Economics was becoming cheerleading for capitalism. The man who led that charge and who could make that the wind of the time was able to get the Nobel Prize and have many of his students also get the Nobel Prize because they were on the Nobel Committee that awarded the prizes to what they did. And it really shows you, as Marx once said, that the leading idea of any age are the ideas in the leaders of that age. And, that's
Right.
what you have at that time. All that leadership is now dissolving. The crash in 2008 and 9, coming at the end of the neoliberal explosion, was a sign that this is not the solution to everything. This is a disaster. And so it's become harder and harder. And the people holding on in the economics profession in the United States, the leftovers, if you like, come from Milton Friedman, and they don't want to give up their positions. You have them all over the United States holding on to the economics departments, but literally dying out now to be replaced by a new generation much more ambivalent about capitalism than these cheerleaders ever were.
Alan Greenspan acknowledging the core defect in my worldview, right? Which was thank you after you helped lead to the housing bubble. Let's throw on some music for a second. We're going to call Dominique Remy. She's going to join us. She's doing a really amazing documentary project. It's called Canary. And the idea is that if you are looking at maternal health and birth rates, it's the canary in the coal mine of broader systems problems in terms of poverty, inequality, race. Very excited about it. So she's going to take a couple of minutes and tell us about the project and how you can support it on GoFundMe in just a minute. Welcome back to the Postgame. Michael Brooks here, along with our esteemed guest, Professor Richard Wolff. And joining us now, I'm very excited to have her, is Dominique Remy. She's a New York-based filmmaker. She's working on her first feature film, Canary, which is what we're going to talk about and what we can all help make happen. She's also the host of a culture podcast called The Bronx with Love. I and David Griscom, as well as Matt Leck, are all equally offended, along with Professor Wolff, that we haven't been invited to be on it yet. Dominique, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. We will talk a little bit more about having a segment for all of you guys to be on the podcast for sure.
All right. Well, I think our business here is done. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I'm heading out now.
Dominique, what is the story of the Canary project and film? and how does it fit? I mean, you're a really important part of the community. You've really sophisticated political analysis. I know you've talked with David about this project. You've talked with me. You want to talk with Professor Wolff and everybody else. What's the story of Canary?
Yeah, so it's been maybe 2.5 years now in the making. I feel like, and then we've talked about this when I called in the first time, my political consciousness kind of came to life during the 2016 election. And part of that was trying to understand where I fit in like larger feminist discourse. And I found really quickly that I was pretty disappointed with the lack of diversity and the lack of awareness around women of color. A lot of the discourse actually is centered around choice. And I think when you expand it, we're going to be using the reproductive justice framework, which is a little bit more expansive, and it does include choice, but it also includes the choice to be a parent. And I think that's really important because when you look at the states with the most draconian abortion laws, they also happen to have really high rates of maternal mortality and morbidity, and that's not by coincidence. And I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged.
What is talk about Canary as an example and the story that you want to tell in this film to illustrate reproductive justice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like when we hear the statistics or we hear headlines about women either dying or having near-death experiences, I think that is the end result. So for me, I toyed around with the title a little bit, but then when I was talking to nurse Monica McLemore, who is a leading researcher in reproductive justice out in the Bay Area, and we were talking about, I want to have a really sociological, 30,000 bird's eye view of what is happening around us that's leading to this, because it's really perplexing, and it's very perplexing if you don't have a class analysis or an analysis about race and oppression in this country. Why this country, having been we're the most developed in the world, have such high rates that we actually have similar rates to use a neoliberal term, underdeveloped worlds in the global south. So that's really perplexing to me. So I figured, so that's how one part of the story. There's something that leads up to the deaths that we have to figure out. And like you kind of said, it serves as a metaphorical canary in the coal mine, because they signal something that we need to figure out, where is this poisonous gas coming from and what is happening. And what I'd like to do is explore that, utilizing a really multidisciplinary approach with sociology, history, economics, and cultural, and also environmental.
Professor Wolff, do you have any thoughts so far on this project?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful project. It is a way into analyzing the society around a dramatic reality. That's always a good teaching device. It's always a good way to get people thinking and talking about both the specific issue you're focused on, but all the larger dimensions that you are, because I can hear it from the way you're describing it, that you're going to touch on, so that you're going to do the kind of broad analysis around a specific topic. That's what everybody needs, and I think will be responded to very well if you can pull that off.
Yeah, I'm really hoping I can pull it off. I find that, again, going back to my own, so this project means a lot to me. One, I am a Black woman, and I inhabit women of color spaces, but also it really does pull together a lot of my own personal political journey and awakening. And I think that, we cannot just talk about one of the things that is really emphasized when we hear about these stories, especially in mainstream media, is that, it's implicit bias within, the medical community, which I understand is an absolute thing, but that's just one part of it. And I think that when you look at the timeline in which a lot of women are dying or hemorrhaging out or like having really terrible experiences, it's within like 6 weeks of giving birth. And like one of the things that it's not afforded to a lot of women because of the privatization of, maternity leave or like family leave, like there's a lot of women who cannot afford to stay home for their own bodies to heal.
Right.
So that's an aspect that needs to be really highlighted.
Dominique, how can we support making this movie happen? Make the pitch, which we should all get on if we can, from to get on this GoFundMe page and help make this project happen.
Yeah, so I remember telling you, I was like, it's not going to be a sexy fundraiser off the jump, because this is a seed fundraising round that we're really looking for. I would really like to take things a little bit further. A lot of the things I'm talking to you right now is like me being steeped into the research phase of this project, but I'm very eager and ready to start collecting footage by end of year. We have it slated for a release and distribution by 2021. So I would love to get it started. And, I'm making a lot of inroads with people, as you know, with Kristen, to interview. But I really want to actually start collecting materials. So this is what this first round of fundraising will be. And it is, you can give whatever your heart's desire. If you can share it, that'd be excellent as well. I'm really looking to, one, not exploit my crew. We don't want that. So I do want some funds to actually have a team working alongside me.
Yep.
And also to collect footage and then to really show the progress and to share with Left is Best community. And I think that can really happen. I really feel strongly that this is going to be a project that's, we're all going to see it. There's going to be a launch party and everything, but also I really do feel like it has to happen.
I agree with you completely. And obviously, we're going to make this into a clip. We're going to release this on YouTube. We're going to continue to talk about it. You're the right person to do this. And this is an incredibly important topic. And as Professor Wolff says, I think a doorway into really everything that we're dealing with. Professor Wolff, do you have any final...
Yeah, and one of the most effective illustrations that I've been able to come up with that might be interesting for you to use too is that the United States, that you probably know this, is one of the very, very few countries in the world that does not have a law mandating both maternal and paternal leaves from the job, sometimes before, sometimes after, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes in some countries for an entire year. And we're behind on all of that. We have no mandated anything. You get it if your employer allows it, if your union is strong enough to get it. But where in other countries they've made it the law because it's a fundamental human right and something that both the parents and the child need, in our country there's no recognition of it, and it is a stark failure of this society compared to virtually every other.
Absolutely. I not to give spoilers, but I don't want this to be completely doom and gloom documentary where it's like, listen, people are dying because of A, B, C, and D. Yeah. But we like to posit some solutions, and unsurprisingly, with reproductive justice, there is a underpinning of economic justice that talks a lot about universal programs. And one of the things that I want to really discuss actually is having a mandated family leave.
Right.
So, yeah.
That is paid, and that has a guarantee that the job is there when you return from whatever that leave. I mean, they're really making it for a country like ours, prattles on endlessly about family values. The hostility to the family is stark. Right. All the more so because of how glaringly it is different from the ideological junk that is spoken.
And then the neoliberal flip, which is like, oh, the ecological crisis. It's not Exxon. You're like having too many kids and don't have a dog. Right. This other nonsense.
Put your garbage in the right bag.
Put your garbage in the right bag. Don't worry about Chevron.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Dominique, let's make this happen. And if you're watching or listening, we have a link to the GoFundMe. Hit it up, support it, continue the conversation in the community, and really good things will come out of this. And I also just want to say, I mean, I'm not that experienced at all in filmmaking, but I know that world enough to know that this fundraising target is actually extremely conservative and modest
Yes,
for doing it. So if you have sticker shock, I understand that 25,000 seems like a lot if you just look at it, but if you have an understanding of how much these things actually cost and how much time it consumes and how much resources go into it, this is very bare bones effort to, but one that is an actual effort, because there's a desire to make an actual professional project here. So let's help make that happen.
Absolutely. I also wanted to say that I am part of the TMBS Discord, so I might pop in there a little bit later. You guys can feel free to hit me up, as well as follow me on Canary Filmmaker. I'm posting my links everywhere. But yeah, if you could contribute any amount, I would be so grateful, and share far and wide, please.
Yeah,
good job, Ryan Gallagher.
Yeah, shout out Ryan.
$20. Well done.
Good job, Ryan.
First of many to come. Dominique, this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
We really have quite an impressive community. A community of incredible peers. We're going to play this brief clip of Bernie, who's on Joe Rogan. Guys, I'm sorry. Post-game, I'll be completely shameless. It is really time to start the Get Michael Brooks on Joe Rogan campaign. There's enough already. And then also the other campaign is Get Cornel West on TMBS. That's actually the most important
I would
campaign.
love that.
Cornel West needs to come on this program. That is a absolute must. Anything that we could do to make that happen. But both of those things, actually, they're both really important. Cornel West on TMBS is the most important. That is really... I'm putting that on the vision board. But all right, let's set this up. So Bernie Sanders was on the Joe Rogan podcast earlier today. This is huge, and this is huge for both of them. I think it's significant. Again, Bernie needs to speak to all major audiences, and like it or not, Joe Rogan is a major audience. And also, this ain't Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard, and I don't even mean that as an insult. I'm talking objectively. Bernie Sanders is a presidential frontrunner. And so this puts Joe Rogan's access to politics in a completely different tier. Let's take a bit from this.
Yeah, so I'm about halfway through listening to this, and Bernie doesn't quite have the range that Cornel West does.
Right.
It kind of stays on message a bit more, but I think this is interesting.
Say, I remember the first time I took DMT, and it reminded me of how Harry Truman said that everything that we did that was good in the country was called socialist, Joe.
So what you sorry, I have to riff on that for a second. A Bernie Sanders psychedelic experiences just lead to the same. It's just like, and then I saw a helix swirling in Jane's eyes, and then I realized that we were part of the same matter, which is why it's absolutely outrageous that we have not raised the minimum wage in this country. All right, go ahead.
Medicare and Medicaid, and to do away with all corporate taxes. So what you have right now, that's what greed is about. They want it all. So as you indicated, you have a company like Amazon, owned by Jeff Bezos, who happens to be the wealthiest guy in America, worth about $150 billion. Amazon paid zero in federal income taxes. And it's not just him. Dozens of corporations paid nothing or very, very little. And on top of all of that, you got these guys able to stash all over the world trillions of dollars in the Cayman Islands, in Bermuda, in Luxembourg, and other tax havens. That is insane. And that has got to end.
Yeah. How is it legal to do that? Why is it legal?
Joe, it is legal because they make the laws.
Right.
All right? That is what here you're touching now on the heart and soul of the tragedy of American politics. How does it happen that on issue after issue, the American people, the working class of this country, want something, nobody pays any attention to it, but billionaires want something, and it gets done? And that has to do with a corrupt political system. So right now, if you are the Koch brothers or some multi-billionaire, you say to the leadership of the Republican Party, and in some cases to the Democratic Party, hey, guess what? We're prepared to put hundreds of millions of dollars into your campaign. Hundreds of millions of dollars coming from one or two people. And here is my agenda. I want tax breaks. I want a trade system which will enable me to shut down in this country and go to China or Mexico and pay people there $2 an hour. I want to be able to do more pollution because I don't like all of this, money I have to spend preventing pollution of the air or the water. That's what I want you to do. And by the way, I'm worried about the deficit, so you may as well cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Good. How many Americans actually believe that we should give tax breaks to billionaires and cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? Very few. That is, talk to Mitch McConnell. Get Mitch on the show. That is exactly what he believes.
So, Professor, I think look, I love Bernie. I'm totally in the bag for the guy. But honestly, even though I understand, and please elaborate on the limitations, but is there something just so, I'll say revolutionary, just even in the most simplest social democratic form of having somebody come back with just some clear class politics in this country?
Absolutely. I mean, we all owe Bernie Sanders an enormous debt. Whether we agree with everything he says or want to go further, like I do in some cases, that's a different matter. We can have that debate. I've actually had it with his folks and with him too. But he did the unthinkable in 2016. Yes. He didn't walk away from the label socialist. He didn't. And in that moment, he opened up the possibility for that to be taken seriously. And when he said, I am not going to be the 1 or 2% candidate, I am going to show you that there's support in the United States way bigger than that for these ideas, and then he did it, we're all in his debt. We all have space in the political life of this society because he was the ornery old senator from Vermont right. who wouldn't be shut up about it. And I don't mean to give it all to him. Look, he wouldn't have done it without the Occupy Wall Street. In right. its way, several years earlier, those young people and other, it wasn't only young people, I like to tell people when they say to me, suppose those folks had come to you a few months earlier. Since I teach at the new school, it's a few blocks from Zuccotti Park, and they said, we're going to set up some tents and we're going to have a tent city, and that's going to be a revolutionary act. I would have thought they were nuts, and I would have told them, you're crazy. No one's going to pay any, you're going to get a page 10 story in the New York Post about it, and it'll be a joke. And I'm so glad they never asked me and that they never got right. my dumb advice, because they went ahead and did something. They had an inkling, those people. They had an inkling that maybe, maybe it could work. And it did. And suddenly, this amazing phenomenon. I remember I went up to Bangor, Maine. The people who had a little encampment on the green in Bangor, Maine, invited me up there to talk to Occupy Wall Street in Bangor, Maine. And there they were, several hundred people having the time of their lives. And what they told me, almost everyone, was it's not about the issues. What we're discovering is there's hundreds of us here in Bangor, Maine. They were listening to me, but they were side-eyeing one another because they wanted to figure out who are these people. They had never come together. They didn't know there were that many. Each of them thought they were the only one with these unusual ideas. That movement is then picked up by Bernie, is now running with Bernie and AOC, and it's bringing more and more people, and it's become part of the discourse, even though everybody and their brother tried to prevent it.
We're going to get to Ben Burgess in a few minutes, but can you first give us a mini primer on Chetty Jagan? Because I am fascinated by
many years
British
ago.
Guyanese
Many years
politician.
ago, and this has happened in so many of the so-called third world countries,
Right.
that at a certain moment, the people there have enough. They have enough of their poverty. They have enough of the corruption of the leaders that are paid by the colonial authorities. And so in British Guyana, it was a little country in Latin America that was a British colony. It was called British Guyana. Right next door was the Dutch Guyana and French Guyana. They carved it up the way they did so much of the world. And a young man, part African, part Indian, because the British had brought Africans there as slaves, but also had brought Indians from India as laborers.
Right.
And again, to
See
create
this across the
differences.
Caribbean.
Yeah,
Yep.
to have the indigenous people suspicious about the Indians and suspicious about the Africans, with the European British sitting on the top and manipulating all of this. And Chetty Jagan, who married a white American woman, who went down there, and the Indian man and the American woman, a radical American woman, went around and organized all of the communities. They had the Africans, they had the Indians, and they had the indigenous people. And they made a revolution, and they took over the government, and the British could do nothing about it. Very important story. And then the CIA and the British M5, they went to work and undid it all and brought in another leader who would do what
And this
Washington
is in the
wanted.
60s?
Yeah, it was back. I remember the exact year. It was either the late 50s or the early 60s.
So this
That's
is in
right.
the same time the CIA is removing Arbenz in Guatemala.
Yeah, all of that.
They're assassinating Lumumba. They're laying waste across
All
the
of
globe.
it. Making sure, as they do to this day,
Right.
in the most grotesque ways in places like Haiti and Honduras, but also, Arbenz in Guatemala, all the succession of leaders in Brazil or Colombia. It was always the same. Periodically, something new would erupt. And the only remarkable thing about Cuba was that when they had their moment, Fidel, the United States couldn't
They couldn't dislodge it.
stop it, and they've been bitter about it ever since. Look at the way they
still trying.
react to Chavez and Maduro. It's the same effort to reestablish the endless grinding poverty that capitalism has meant for Latin America for 300 years.
Where did
It's
Chetty
terrible.
Jagan fit politically?
He was
socialist, Marxist?
he was a socialist.
Right.
Interesting. His wife was an American leftist coming out of the American 1930s socialist communist milieu. Forget her name right now. No, he was a self-conscious. He had studied, I believe, in England. Like so many third world leaders, it was when they were students in the metropolitan country that they met metropolitan socialists and Marxists and got these ideas and then began to make them relevant to their colonial situation. Ho Chi Minh did that. Many of the leaders of communist
What I love
China
about
did
Cabral is that then it cross-migrated back in his
back.
case because he actually influenced the Portuguese, his colonial occupiers, but then he influenced the Carnation Revolution. They took his ideas, migrated it
By the
back
way,
to
China
Portugal.
is the same. If you look at the early leaders around Mao, they had been students in Germany, particularly, where they had encountered, Marxism, and all over French Africa. They encountered the Marxism of Paris and France, and so it's a very interesting cross-fertilization. And then later, now you can see it's coming back through the immigrant populations. Some of that filtered anti-capitalism resurfaces in the metropolitan countries. Very interesting, and it also shows you how dangerous it is to polarize that, as if there's a European that hasn't been shaped by the African or vice versa. It really is much more homogenized than folks like to admit.
Well, isn't that a great answer? I mean, this is what I'm actually arguing in my book, that There's the Western chauvinist, bigoted, there's one continuous civilization from Athens to the America, this ridiculous, nonsense, ahistorical, right-wing exclusionary tradition. But then there's this, it's an understandable reaction, but it's also just as wrong, which is that, we're in these little micro communities and everybody has their distinct, and of course they're distinct, but there can't be any overlap, there can't be any solidarity. And then of course the reality that part of the rebuke to all of these racist narratives is that in fact, like, ancient Rome was African. Greek philosophers were African in some cases. So actually you always have this cross-pollination and migration having an internationalist cosmopolitan flavor.
Also, there's this notion that the colonial experience, the French, the Germans, the British, the Dutch, as if it was all they controlled. Yeah, that's a delusion. They were also shaped by the people they controlled in 1,000 ways, whether it is the rape of the local women, it is the interaction of the children, it is the impact of new cuisines, of new cultural forms, of new ideas. It runs very complicated in all directions. Sorting that out as if you could neatly compartmentalize the European from the not is an arrogance, but it's also ignorant. It didn't work like that. It's a delusion of a kind of master notion that never was true.
We're going to call Ben Burgess. We can keep it flowing. We're going to do the debunk, and then we have a few more sounds to get to. But first, we'll talk to Ben Burgess. Is that coming up on? Okay, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Postgame. Joining us now is Ben Burgess. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He's here with Professor Richard Wolff. I want to go to mock. And here's your song, Ben, which you're so enthusiastic about.
Okay, nice.
Oh, nice. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit. Breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay, break it down. Break it down. Break it down, Ben. Break it down, Ben. It's so trippy. So, Ben, tonight, along with Professor Richard Wolff, you were going to debunk some arguments against the Green New Deal, and we have two pieces of sound. First, they're both from the Democratic debates. First of Andrew Yang and then of John Hickenlooper. We're going to play them both, and then we will collectively debunk.
Right, the important number in Vice President Biden's remarks just now was that the United States is only 15% of global emissions. We like to act as if we're 100%, but the truth is, even if we were to curb our emissions dramatically, the Earth is still going to get warmer. And we can see it around us this summer. The last 4 years have been the 4 warmest years in recorded history. This is going to be a tough truth, but we are too late. We are 10 years too late. We need to do everything we can to start moving the climate in the right direction, but we also need to start moving our people to higher ground. And the best way to do that is to put economic resources into your hands so you can protect yourself and your families.
I was challenged by the Vice President.
That was a funny. Wait, with $1,000 extra bucks a month, you can move to high altitude? I'm sorry. I was trying to ease up on the Yank people, but this is going to make them freak out all over again. Should we play Hickenlooper first before we tee off on that? But okay, let's do Yang first. I couldn't. Okay, whatever.
Doesn't that sound like an Onion headline? Andrew Yang said, "Too late to do anything about climate change. Just move to higher ground."
With $1,000. I mean, honestly, like, even if I woke up one day and said, you know what, fuck it, we need to do this show in Canada, it's too dangerous here, I don't think $1,000 a month is going to do that.
Yeah, the idea that that's going to be enough for like those unemployed, industrial workers he's always talking about to relocate their families and their lives is interesting.
Yeah. Also,
Professor Wolff,
if their jobs are where they are, and they move to where the ground is higher, and there are no jobs there, how's this going to work out real well? Or does he imagine we're going to move all the production facilities and the transport facilities and the storage facility? An economy takes a long time to articulate itself in time and space, and this isn't adjusted by moving to higher ground. This is you got a lot more to do than that. Even if we want to end up at a higher place, that's an enormous job, which, by the way, takes real careful, coordinated, here we go, planning, which the society does not like or want. So you're going to leave it to be privately enterprised? Oh, good. That adds another 40 years during which the heat will melt us all.
I mean, Ben, do you have anything else to add to that? I mean, that is just.
I just remember a few weeks ago we were talking about Yang, and because one of and the reason part of the reason we were talking about him then was because one of his fans got upset at us on Twitter for calling him a defeatist. But I mean, like, this is a parody of defeatism. Like, this is the Yang solution to everything. Well, we're not going to solve the problem, so let's just give everybody $1,000 to hope for the best.
Well, is that I want to? Can we open that theme for just a minute from both of you? Because that actually, I've realized, and maybe it's an elusive obvious, and everybody else is ahead of me on this. But yes, if you just went on paper, there's plenty of other Democratic candidates that are more objectionable than Yang in terms of policy, even. Frankly, if you take for granted, if you believe that he supports Medicare for all, that puts him ahead of a lot of them. Even the fact that there's problems with his solutions, but he centers, working class issues to some extent. But I realize that, and there's plenty of different problems, but the core of it is just the idea that meeting the future with quote unquote, like innovative, practical, human-centered solutions is complete defeat. We can't do anything about the corporations. We can't do anything about climate. I mean, what kind of... Yeah, I mean, sorry, guys, just go off on that. I find that so depressing.
It's astounding, like, that his... again, it's like we were talking about last time, that, the correct part of what he says, like, about unemployment is, education won't solve it. But then his next move seems to be, therefore, let's not even worry about trying to solve it and just give everybody $1,000 so they don't get hungry enough to riot.
What is it,
for me? It panders to the lowest conceivable denominator. It's another candidate saying, here, I'm going to hand you some money. It's buying votes. It's, look, I'm going to give you some money, and now you're going to be able to solve this problem. There are no structural issues. There's no organizational question that has to be resolved. There's nothing about how we work as a society. There's nothing about the division of our country into employers, a small number, and employees, a vast number, one of whom has all the levers of power, the other one of whom lives like a drone. None of those questions are addressed. We're going to solve this by throwing money at individuals who will then hopefully spend it in such a way that magically all of the social problems are overcome, which is something money can do when you don't know or care about the structure of the society in which that money circulates. It is colossally unfair to people to talk like that. It's silly. It's the modern version of saying, look, we have terrible problems, but if you go into the forest and you hug a tree and you're wearing red shirt, it's really going to help.
Yeah.
Hugging a tree might help more, actually. If you ever watch Jerry Adams talk about hugging trees, it's very compelling. Anyway,
fair enough.
Yes.
Well, it probably is going to make you feel better at least. But just to piggyback on Professor Wolff's point about the division of society into employers and employees, I know I've made this point before, but I really feel like this has to be hammered every time we talk about Andrew Yang, that if you, like, under capitalism, automation has, might result in, structural unemployment. There's some arguments about whether it's going to actually do that, or whether new jobs will ultimately be created. But, certainly in the short term, automation responds in unemployment, whereas any kind of system that erased that division between employers and employees, if the workers own the company, they could just vote to give themselves fewer hours for the same pay.
Exactly.
So briefly, and then we'll get to Hickenlooper, but honestly, in a minute, because I know exactly, part of the responses to this from these people will be emotional and overwrought and kind of funny and ridiculous. But what about that response that maybe we need to listen to more, not in terms of agreeing with, but dealing with, which is, I don't actually have any faith in any of these macro solutions. I've grown up with nothing but political and economic failure. I live on the margins. I could speak personally that there's plenty of times in my life, both as an adult and growing up, where I certainly wouldn't have objected to anybody putting an extra $1,000 in my pocket. And I probably would have been a little bit pissed off, frankly, at, people saying like, oh, no, wait for the democratized economy. Fuck you. I got to buy groceries or so on. That is the most legitimate answer they have, in my view. I actually, I agree with that sentiment. So how do we answer the strong version of their sentiment?
Well, I think one thing that we can say is that it's not that we're even necessarily against, putting $1,000 in everybody's pocket, right? There are socialists, like Dr. King, for example, who have supported some version of a UBI, but they've supported a yes and UBI, right? A UBI that would be on top of other expansions of social programs, which is very different from saying you get $1,000 period, even if you're on disability, you have to choose between that and the $1,000. So that's part of the answer. But another part of the answer, I would think, is that inflation exists. I'm trying not to be too smarmy about this, but it really is like
your landlord exists, and if you don't have rent control, where will your $1,000 go?
Your $1,000 will be. That's the problem. In this system, you give everybody $1,000, and that will become the profit of a dozen corporations in one or two cycles of that money moving around the society. You've done nothing to prevent that $1,000 ending up exactly the way the previous $100,000 went through each family's income as the members of the family got the money and brought it home, and then they had to pay the rent, and then they had to pay for their car, and then they had to buy their groceries, and then they had to repay the loans that they had taken out, and then they had to try to get their kid to college, and pretty soon the money was gone, and they were pinched and looking for a candidate who would give them $1,000. The $1,000 gets them through the next week or month, and then it's gone into a system that makes sure they're as poor a month from now as they were before we gave them the $1,000. It's a quick fix that changes nothing in their basic situation, which most people would figure out. The reason they want the $1,000 is because they don't believe anything else is on offer anyway.
That's to me, though, that is actually, I just listened to a really interesting podcast with Bree Joy Gray, the Hear the Burn podcast. She had on John Favreau.
I've been listening to that. That's good.
It was really good. At first, I would listen to the one I was on, frankly. But the one with John Favreau, and what was fascinating, though, all kidding aside, although I'm not kidding, of course you should listen to mine first.
No, that was good.
It was brilliant. But the one that John Favreau, though, the Obama guy, and this is a really important argument moving forward for the election, he agreed with her completely. He basically said, whether it is a centrist or a left, the most important thing is the social movement behind the president, a Democrat. John Favreau, 100% on board with Bernie's core message. And he said, though, he talked about going to a focus group in Texas, I think. And he said, and these were basically, I think they were Obama voters who weren't voting anymore, not to Trump. They had already checked out of the system. And he said, yes, some of them were convinced by Bernie and they were ready to go, and others were just done. They were so cynical and so exhausted. And I always say, it's like on one hand, Bree said that cynicism is even a bigger threat than Trump in some ways, which I agree with. Yeah. And on the other hand, that cynicism is the most understandable thing in the world. And that's what Andrew Yang is So as much as some of his people are just ridiculous and overwrought and throw tantrums over anything, the part of like the real desperation I want to at least understand and meet on some level, even as look, Lula did a form of basic income, but he also built hundreds of new universities and gave everybody, expanded healthcare drastically and introduced higher wages. And, you don't just slash everything else or leave everything else and give people $1,000. It's not going to work.
No, totally. And like, I get that, like, okay, everything else has failed, at least $1,000. That's going to be a concrete small improvement. I get that response. So I think there are at least two things we could say to it. One of them might be a harder sell, but then the other one I think is going to help. So one of them is that it's not a choice between Yang bucks and like waiting for the complete abolition of capitalism to happen. We also have Bernie Sanders, right? That's who has a social democratic agenda that is both going to be a more realistic springboard for more radical horizons after that, and also is something that even in the here and now is going to be less vulnerable to those problems that Professor Wolff was talking about than $1,000 are, because a lot of the things in the Bernie agenda are things like abolishing private health insurance premiums, abolishing public university tuition, and those things aren't vulnerable to just being eaten up by everybody raising the prices a little bit.
And you can go even further. Those kinds of structural changes, even one of them would be worth a hell of a lot more than $1,000, so that you can get the idea across. You're going for a much bigger prize when you go after these other issues. It's only the deepest cynicism that all of the other issues are unchangeable, unattackable, untransformable. So you might as well take your $1,000 because it's really 1,000 or nothing, and 1,000's clearly better than nothing.
We need to get serious. You should move on top of a hill.
Very inspiring message.
Yes.
It's time to get serious. But
and then use up the $1,000 to commute the extra distance from your higher ground home to where your job is.
And by the way, the robot's still coming to fuck your wife. I'm sorry. I had to tag it with that. You can edit it out in the final clip. Night by the year 2040 when robots are having sex with your wife. All right, I can't. It is impossible for me to do a full serious Andrew Yang segment. All right, John Hickenlooper. We have the futuristic, there's nothing we can achieve candidate. Now we have at least Delaney has like a certain just like ridiculous belligerent asshole flavor to him. Hickenlooper is the most depressing thing in American public life. Let's check it out.
Congressman O'Rourke, we've been asking voters to weigh in on what they'd most like to hear Democrats debate. Among the topics they told us they're most interested in, the climate crisis. Congressman Delaney, I'll start with you. You say the Green New Deal is about as realistic as Trump saying Mexico is going to pay for the wall. But scientists say we need essentially to eliminate fossil fuel pollution by 2050 to avoid the most catastrophic consequences. Why isn't this sweeping plan to fight the climate crisis realistic?
Well, first of all, because it ties its progress to other things that are completely unrelated to climate.
Yeah, I thought so too. That's my bad.
Oh, okay.
But let's finish here.
We'll finish, but I need to reset. This is obviously John Delaney.
In my defense, these are both extremely forgettable people.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Like universal health care, guaranteed government jobs, and universal basic income. So that only makes it harder to do.
All right. So just to recap, what he just said was that he'd said previously that that you couldn't talking about a Green New Deal was just as unrealistic as saying that Mexico would pay for the wall. He's asked exactly what's wrong with it. And what he says is, well, what's wrong with it is that it's packaged together with these other things like a federal jobs guarantee that they don't have anything to do with climate change. It's just a separate issue. And so it's mixing up the issues. That's going to make it harder to pass. That, as far as I can tell, is his argument against it.
Right. Yep.
And so one thing just to note, like right out of the gate, is that last month after the first debates, we were talking about the bad arguments against Medicare for all, and the bad arguments against a Green New Deal in a weird way are kind of all pulling in the opposite direction as the bad arguments against Medicare for all. So one of the bad arguments against Medicare for all was that it's horrible because people aren't going to have choice. That kind of like really important, autonomy that we all get a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment out of deciding whether we, whether we're going to get Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield. Unless, of course, we get it through our employer.
Excuse me. Put some respect on Oscar's name.
But now the Green New Deal with one of the objections is, it's packaged together with this federal job guarantee. So it's really important that people get to choose which parasitical private health insurance company is trying to come up with reasons not to pay for the procedure they need. But it's apparently also bad for people to have a choice between working in the private sector and working in the public sector.
Right.
So that's confusing just right off the bat. And then the other thing is that it's not unrelated at all. So just to spell out a couple of really obvious ways in which the climate change fighting aspects of the Green New Deal. And I know it only counts for 15%, which I love the way Yang, by the way, threw that out there as if that wasn't massively disproportionate for the population of the U.S.
Right.
But,
see our China economic conversation earlier.
Right. But yeah, that, that 15% that we have, that it's not trying to cut back on that, on carbon emissions and having a jobs guarantee. These are not unrelated at all. There are at least two ways in which they're really importantly related. One of them has to do with the concept of a just transition. So there's actually a really good today in Jacobin. There's an article about coal miners in Harlan County. It's called "They're Not Moving Until We Get Paid." That gets into this point that a just transition means that as we shift away from an economy based on these non-renewable energy sources, we have to ensure that the people who are employed by those industries are taken care of. $1,000 a month isn't going to get it done, right? They need new jobs. So that's one obvious relationship, that if we're going to say certain industries have to be phased out because of their economic impact, then it's not at all unrelated to say, well, we need to make sure those people have new jobs. And not only is that not going to make it harder to pass, it makes it much easier to pass, because that means that those workers are a constituency for the Green New Deal, not a constituency against it. And then the other way in which it's related is that if we're going to be making all of these massive infrastructure changes to make everything greener, well, that is going to involve, a lot, like that is a massive, massive infrastructure program. So it makes perfect sense to have the federal government do a lot of that directly. And I know that there's kind of a galaxy-brained free market response to what I just said, which is, hey, Ben, you just said on the one hand that these jobs for coal miners, other things that are going to be phased out are going to go away because of a green transition. On the other hand, you said that there are new jobs that are created. So great, why do we need a federal jobs guarantee? That the people who lose the old jobs will just get the new jobs. But I think we kind of know at this point that that's not how it works. That there is, in fact, no structural guarantee whatsoever that the middle-aged ex-coal miner is going to be the one getting the new job. And in fact, more often than not, that's not how it works at all. So we can solve both of these problems, though, if we have, like Professor Wolff was talking about earlier, conscious large-scale planning in order to make the transition work.
Professor Wolff, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'm always amazed by it. If you want to have the private sector step up, good. Let's invite the private sector to step up. A jobs guarantee simply means that if the private sector steps up and there's still millions of people without a job, then the government hires them. That's what it always meant. So let's see what the private sector can do. but it's going to have to do a pretty damn good job because it's going to have to provide a lot of jobs, and it's going to have to match the decent income that the public sector will pay people who do that job, which is, by the way, why the private sector hates all of this, because they're going to actually have to face real competition from the public sector. And they only talk about competition on the 4th of July when they give speeches about how good it is. It's the last thing on earth they want to confront from a public sector that was set up to do that.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen. So you should move to a higher elevation, take $1,000, and move your family. Yes.
All right, Ben Burgess, the debunk.
Yeah, so one, can I make just one more point about
really
this?
Tight, really tight.
Real quick. So I just finished reading a book called Democracy at Work: Cure for Capitalism.
Yes, indeed.
At the end of that book, in the last section, there's a suggestion that there's a natural alliance between a movement for workers' cooperatives and the movement for the Green New Deal. Which makes a lot of sense insofar as you do have, public-private partnerships as part of any Green New Deal. And this goes back to something we were talking about after the debate I did with Destiny, which is that if we had, as part of a Green New Deal, a provision that, hey, okay, so if you're going to get public contracts for private companies to do some of this infrastructure stuff, we're going to preferentially give those out to worker-owned companies. Exactly. That would make a lot of sense, and it would also be closely related to the goals of a Green New Deal, because if the company is being run by workers who have to inhale whatever's going on at the job site, who have to live in the places environmentally affected by what they're doing, they're probably going to make ecologically much better company-level decisions than companies that are owned by people who don't work there and don't live in the community.
And one final thought.
Yes, please.
If you developed a Green New Deal and you did exactly as you said, give some preferential contracts to worker co-ops and worker-owned enterprises, here's what you would be doing. For the first time in American history, you'd actually be giving Americans freedom of choice, because they would have both the private sector run hierarchically in a capitalist manner, top down, and across the street, down the road, a worker co-op. People could decide from whom they prefer to purchase, and people could decide with whom they prefer to do their work. And they'd have real choice because they would have these enterprises around them to try to see, to compare. We don't have that choice now, so the freedom of choice that is absent would actually be built if you had a worker co-op sector, and a Green New Deal would be an easy way to do that.
I look at property in Montpelier.
All right, I'm sorry. Ben Burgess, author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, The Debunk. Check him out on Patreon. Check him out everywhere. Ben, thanks a million.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to do 2 pieces of sound. I apologize in advance. We're definitely not going to get to all the questions. I'll try to get to a couple, but I want to just do 2 quick pieces of sound. First, this is Jeremy Corbyn's response to Boris Johnson's plans for the NHS. And I'm wondering, Professor Wolff, if you could just sort of give us a little analysis on the present state of UK politics based off of this.
Firstly, we need to unspin the headline behind this, put out the facts. So this new money, which I heard Matt Hancock say this morning on your channel, it's not new money, it's old money. The Nuffield Trust, a very respected health think tank, have said that this is old money that was already given to hospitals under Theresa May. Today, essentially, they're removing the controls to allow hospitals to spend it. Number 2, this money is not going to be able to do what it's being promised. So Boris Johnson is saying that they want to get rid of the backlog of maintenance, of repairs in our hospitals. We have huge problems in our hospital buildings, including ceilings falling in, water leaks, lifts not working. The cost of doing that is $6 billion. So this money is just not going to cut it. And thirdly, the reason why our hospitals are in such a state, in such disrepair, is because we had $4 billion being taken away from capital funding by this government. So this money is not enough, it's not new, and it's not going to do what's promised.
Boris Johnson just coming into power, I mean, he's basically, as she said, he's allocating money that's already set for the NHS. Are they about to have their own sort of Trump scam? And what do you think of Corbyn's prospects now?
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson is England's Trump. He is the product of a working class savaged by the great crash of 2008. The working class in England has suffered real wage losses worse than that, at least statistically, here in the United States. They were desperate. They were about, particularly because they have a tradition of socialism, a tradition of effectively a socialist party, the Labour Party. And so there was a real danger in England, more than in the United States, that this anger at the failures of capitalism, followed by an austerity that put the burden of bailing out British banks on the backs of the people, would turn the population against capitalism and bring in Corbyn as a socialist. And so the solution to that problem was to distract the British people by telling them that their problems were not capitalism, but were immigrants and Europe. And that's a perfect analogy with the United States. Immigrants and China, or immigrants and any foreigner that we do trade with who has been stealing from our piggy bank, in the logic of Mr. Trump. And Mr. Johnson just repeats that. It's immigrants and it's Europeans who are taking us over and dictating to us British, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. His problem, like Trump's, is that the mass of people in England love the National Health Service, rely on it, need it, feel about it the way Americans basically feel about Medicare also. And so no politician dares confront it, including the conservatives. It's political suicide. So here's how you handle that situation. You take away money, little bits here and there. You make the system non-functional, the way that young woman just said. The buildings are falling apart, the lift doesn't work, and so what you want is the public to get disgusted by the quality of the service and then be angry, and then be willing to go with the conservatives to cut it as a kind of punishment for its dysfunction. Or in the language of American conservatives, starve the beast, the government. And so that's what they're doing, and they're hoping to get away with it by saying we're moving money or new money, or we love the NHS while they gut it, and then give maximum publicity to the operation that didn't happen, to the service that wasn't rendered, as a way of undercutting the public sector and serving their private donors who make that party be what it is. Very pathetic. And the only question is whether Jeremy Corbyn can mobilize both his radical members and enough of the press to be able to get the alternative message out to the British people. And so far, he has been 50-50 on getting that job done. He's made good progress in some ways, but he is hampered. The old line, Tony Blair kind of Labour people hate him, undercut him every chance they get, accuse him of anti-Semitism or whatever else they can throw at him. The media are typically conservative because they're owned by Murdoch and folks like that. So he has a tremendous difficulty getting the message out in the face of the government. But in the end, it's the British people that keep that conservative government in power. And it's an amazing testimony to me, having been betrayed by the failure of capitalism to deliver on its promises, the collapse of 2008, the austerity imposed on the British afterward, all by the Labour Party, by the Conservative Party, and yet they've been able to deflect all of the rage, and it's enormous in England, onto immigrants and onto the Europeans to get the crazy Brexit vote. And even though it unraveled everything in England, they still can hold on. They keep beating that horse. And Mr. Johnson is the final last gasp of running a politics that gets away from the economic crisis and pretends it's a crisis of Polish plumbers coming in to work in England and of European bureaucrats who are telling us what to do. The childishness is, but then again, it reminds me of Milton Friedman, who's hateful towards the bureaucrat, as if the bureaucrat in a public office is some fundamentally different animal from the bureaucrat in the corporate office across the street. The mentality is spectacular.
Well, there's the Tory scam. One final piece of sound and just one or two questions, and then we're out of here. This is important. This is Cornel West on Democracy Now! And I want you to just reflect on this as well. He's talking about the necessity of, and of course, we have to protect Barack Obama from the just pure racist attacks that existed the whole time during his presidency. And of course, we can be real and objective reality that obviously Barack Obama is infinitely better than Donald Trump. But we also have to be real about President Obama's legacy and the broader reality of the Democratic Party in the third way if we can move forward. Cornel West put this forward on Democracy Now!, and I'd like your thoughts, Professor Wolff.
Democratic Party come to terms with Obama and his legacy, because it's clear that hardly anyone wants to critically examine it. So you can't say too much about the Wall Street bailout explicitly. You can't say too much about the drones. You can't say too much about the wars in Libya and Somalia and the bombs in Yemen. You can't say too much about the very ugly Israeli occupation. You can't say too much about the ugly Egyptian authoritarianism, though they are tied to the Obama administration. So the Democratic Party is in a very tough situation, because you've got Democrats who are in love with our dear brother Barack Obama, and we know he's a zillion times better in many ways than the Trump in the White House right now. But on the other hand, it wasn't a golden age, and I think we have to be very candid about this. And this is part of the tightrope that needs to be walked, I think, by those part of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, because you had to be able to tell the truth. You had to be committed to the suffering of poor and working people. I don't care where they are. They could be in Tel Aviv and Gaza. They can be in Mexico City or El Paso. They can be in Guatemala or Ethiopia or Somalia, Dalits in India, Uyghurs in China, and so forth. And so those of us who are on the outside, more social movement activists, let's say, as opposed to insiders, we've got to be able to speak our truth and bring power and pressure to bear, even as we connect with various statesmen and politicians. One of the reasons why I spend the wonderful time and precious moments that I do with my dear brother Bernie Sanders is not because I think he's pure and pristine, but in many ways he is the last hope in terms of dealing with the planet in catastrophic mode, and dealing with the grotesque wealth inequality, and dealing with the legacies of white and male supremacy.
Professor Wolff.
Yeah, I mean, I've been personally friends with Cornel West most of my adult life. I've worked together with him, appeared with him countless times. And I share much of what he has to say. But I need to go beyond. I understand the importance of speaking truth to power. But the problem with that is that it leaves us with the truth and them with the power. And so I need to go further. For me, I think Barack Obama was a disaster. I think if you look at the economic, and I'm an economist, so I focus perhaps too much on that. He bailed out Wall Street.
Right.
He did it over and over again. He promised to help masses of people who lost their homes. That never really worked out real well. And he left a society more unequal than when he found it, with the biggest losers being the African-American community that lost its home, which was the only wealth most of the African-American community was able to accumulate. They got sucked into that mortgage hustle, often by unscrupulous bankers and mortgage brokers and all of that, and then lost it when the austerity and so forth made it impossible for them to maintain their payments. But this was known, this was seen during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And the excuse he gave for not doing the things that he had promised the labor movement, that he had promised, to close Guantanamo, all the other things.
Right.
The excuse he gave was, well, I don't have a mass movement behind me, and it's your fault, not my. I'll do it, but you've got to mobilize the people. Well, at the one moment that there was a real mobilization of people who would have supported all of that, called Occupy Wall Street, he mowed it down. He organized all those cities at the same time, starting here with Mr. Bloomberg in office in New York, to literally bulldoze those young people out of the tents in all those cities. He didn't build the movement he said he wanted to give him the support to do what he said he believed. So I don't believe him. I think he was exactly the right person at a moment of capitalism's crisis, when it was vulnerable, when it was down, when it had failed, when it had shown that the notion that we learned the lessons of how to manage capitalism in the crisis of the 1930s, here was a demonstration. We didn't learn anything. We couldn't prevent one almost as bad after promising everything. This was a capitalism that was in trouble. It needed to have a leader that could make sure that the African-American community, the progressive community, and the labor movement wouldn't act, because it was their person in office. It was their friend. It was their spokesperson. And so we had, quote, social peace. And the social peace, presided over by Mr. Barack Obama, built no movement, and so allowed Mr. Trump to come in, build a quickie movement on the right, with no effective opposition. The mobilization
I'm the only one between you and the pitchforks.
The mobilization behind Obama his first time was dissipated by the second time and was completely gone by the end. Couldn't mobilize anybody. Look at the sad performance of Mrs. Clinton afterwards. She was close to him, he was close to her, and yet couldn't do anything in the face of the reaction. That's at the very best horrible political planning.
There you have it from my dear brother Richard Wolff. All right, final, just two questions. Again, apologies, I can't get to everybody. Let's see. I really enjoyed Professor Wolff's book, Contending Economic Theories, as have I. It's a great book. Thank you, Professor Wolff. Although the Keynesian math kind of loses me. Anyway, I think about how some of us from poor and working class backgrounds end up being roped into selling drugs or other illicit activity. I was wondering if you could give a sort of Marxist analysis of the underground market in this dynamic, the black market.
Yeah, black markets always exist.
Right.
It is a congenital problem of capitalism that its contradictions always lead to the proscription of all kinds of activities. It can't handle all kinds of activities. It represses those or outlaws those, which immediately then create the opportunity. And since it drives so many people into unemployment, since it constantly tries to save on its labor costs by either cheapening the labor, not paying them as much, or firing them, or automating them out of existence, you're creating the desperate people who need to find their way to the illegal universe that you likewise create. You literally create the whole thing. You create the demand and you create the supply. The demand for services that are, quote, illegal, and the desperate people who can't earn a living any other way. And so you can see that over and over again, whether it's sex trade, whether it's alcohol, whether it's marijuana, you name it, it immediately outlaws this because, for example, marijuana is too great a danger for the alcohol business. Okay, right. We won't drink, we're going to smoke dope. Okay, so the alcohol companies understand it, they get together with the religious community, and they block marijuana. Meantime, the automation is wiping out jobs on a record pace, leading, hello, who's surprised? The people who need to have an income and now have a place to get that income because you've created the proscribed area where things have to be. And so we have that. Capitalism reproduces criminals as effectively as it reproduces everything else. Marx said that in several essays, in wonderful essays, where he says the reason poverty is always with us is capitalism is as successful in reproducing poverty as it is in reproducing wealth. And the same thing is true. It's effective in reproducing legal enterprise right alongside illegal enterprise. They come out of the same competitive logic of the system.
So what you should do is take $1,000 and move to a higher altitude.
All right. Final question of the night. I apologize. Can't get to all else. Dave from Jamaica. What is China's end goal now, since it doesn't seem to be achieving communism anymore?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It says it's aiming for communism, but it also puts it so far in the future that it's almost an empty kind of gesture. I think they are committed to building their mixed system, a system of government enterprise, high organization of the government. Right. Look, the government managing the economy has been successful for what they wanted. We can criticize what they wanted. Why didn't they want more personal freedom? Why didn't they want more politically diverse? And those are valid criticisms to raise. But that's not what they've been setting out to do. And they do have the history of China, which never did those things, on their side. That's who they are. That's where their society comes from. I think the demands for these freedoms are coming. They're already there. And the rest of the world will infuse those into China anyway. But I think for the time being, they say the following. The fastest growing economy in the 20th century was the Soviet Union. It went from the poorest country in Europe to a global superpower alongside the United States between 1913 and 1975. That's an incredibly short historical time during which they fought and lost World War I, they fought World War II, they had a revolution, they had a civil war, they had a foreign invasion, and they had the collectivization of agriculture. That they came through any of those is a miracle. Right. That they came through and became a rich, powerful country is a stunning achievement. The only country to outdo them in becoming rich instead of poor is the People's Republic of China. Look, we know the story here in the United States because we celebrate it. How poor people with poor beginnings fought and kicked and scratched their way to become rich. And along the way, they became nasty, ugly people. That's a nasty, ugly reality. It happens to countries, too. In other words, I'm not celebrating that the Chinese were successful, but to pretend that they weren't, or to pretend that private capitalism is what made them strong, when clearly they're not a private capitalist country. Right. And the same people who celebrate that private capitalism made them strong are the first ones to bemoan the fact that private capitalism take a second seat in that country to the Communist Party and the public sector. I think they have achieved something. They're not going to change it. That's why the United States notion, we will not trade with you unless you change your... We're not changing. Why would we change what has succeeded for us so well? You Americans can't grow the way we're... You're frightened of us because we're growing faster than you, and you want us to change our system. Are you crazy? It's the system that makes you take us seriously.
Right.
It's the first thing that you ever did. Otherwise, we would just be some racially inferior other, treating us the way you do, Latinos, Africans, other Asian. Come on. Right. You're taking us real seriously, and that's a testimony to what we've done. We're not going to change that. You better come to terms with us, or else we're going to have a lot of trouble, and there's 300 million you, and there's 1.5 billion us. Don't forget it.
That's the post game, everybody. I guess I really regret not learning Mandarin. Professor Wolff, I appreciate your time so much, as always. It's always such an honor and privilege to have you.
And I'm very happy that there's a program like yours out there that does these things, that supports that film, that makes fun of things that need to be made fun of. This no, really. No. That's for humor is as important and powerful as anything else, and that mixing the humor with the politics that's a real skill, and I'm very happy.
Can't wait to have you back on again soon, and I look forward to to joining you to talk about my book.
Good.
So
that will happen.
Awesome. And hopefully you'll come back again in the fall if you can.
And I will be more than happy to work with you to see if we can, both of us, get Cornell to come and work with us.
Oh yes. That's music to my everything. Everybody, we appreciate all of you. We got to run. Thank you.